Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Truth and Happiness, Episode 2, Odysseus. Last episode, I covered the overall outline of the story and themes of the Odyssey. The next leg of this analysis will take on the same approach we took with the Iliad. The question before us now, is Odysseus the hero of the Odyssey? Within this question will be a series of sub-questions. What kind of man is Odysseus? What kind of father, king, husband? How does Odysseus measure against the objective standards of each category? The overall answer seems obvious. It seems Odysseus is the hero and that we should judge him not too harshly in any category, as it is not entirely his fault that he was away from home for 20 years. But what criteria is this conclusion based on? That Odysseus must be the hero since he is, firstly, the main character, and secondly, he accomplished extraordinary and even supernatural or heroic feats that render him worthy of an epic poem on its own? Are accomplishments, heroic or ordinary, truly the only measurement of a man or woman's heroic status? In the case of objective truth, actions matter, but are measured by their intention. The central question I am answering focuses on the quality of Odysseus as a man, not solely the magnitude of his actions. Ignoring Odysseus's actions, however, would be as detrimental to the analysis as would be ignoring his intentions that give form to his actions. Both, therefore, will be taken into consideration as well as their wide-ranging effects. One of the basic qualities readers must bear in mind is that Odysseus, like many Greek heroes of myth, is prideful. Anyone who embraces morals in any ethical and or religious system always has pride somewhere on the do not have and or do not do list of behaviors and dispositions. The question before us is simply how much to a degree is Odysseus plagued by pride? In other words, is Odysseus mildly prideful, which gets him into trouble every now and then, but still retains the quality of character required to be a hero? Virtue, in other words? Or is Odysseus so riddled with pride that he loses his hero status to something between hero and villain, whatever that may be? Or is Odysseus quite simply a prideful villain who embraces no restraint on his own being to where he regards himself as a cunning force of nature and is skeptical about anything that lays outside his power? If so, how different would Odysseus be from Achilles? Is there not another Hector who regards virtue and suffering for virtue as bearing merit in and of itself, present in the Odyssey? To answer these questions, we must analyze several episodes from the Odyssey that tell us more about Odysseus as a man, his philosophical view of the cosmos, including the gods and other universals such as morality, and therefore what philosophical argument Odysseus represents. Note that these two last items are not exactly the same thing. The author of any book will not always agree with the arguments the characters represent. The first quality of Odysseus, his pride, has already been noted. However, having a suitable definition of pride that is applicable to all ages of history is conducive at this point before I depart onto other aspects of Odysseus. Pride is simply having a high opinion of yourself to where you believe rules, eternal and or temporal, do not apply to you in either certain situations or at all completely. I have admittedly noted Odysseus's pride without giving much evidence for that pride. My justification for this is that pride, in the definition provided above, taken from Aristotle, Aquinas' school of thought, is both an action and a disposition that leads to other behaviors. When considering Odysseus and his pride, we must therefore look for actions that are either prideful by themselves or rooted in pride. To that end, I will begin with Odysseus's consistency in deceitful behavior. Odysseus encounters multiple people whom he spins tall tales for. Odysseus does this usually to protect his identity, but there was one instance where, After returning home and clearing out the suitors, Odysseus goes to see his ailing father, who is heartbroken not only because he has not seen his own son in 2 decades, but also has to deal with the death of his wife, who died of grief at the long absence of Odysseus. Yet, even knowing all this, Odysseus decides that, instead of revealing himself to his father right away, and in the torment of a father who has virtually lost his whole family for no short amount of time, he will instead deceive his father and tell the man a tall tale with the full intention of deceiving him. Odysseus does not keep the deception up for long, but this does go to show that Odysseus, while he does love his family, is also riddled with pride that has an isolating effect on Odysseus that keeps him at arm's length from everyone else around him. Odysseus clearly loves his family, but also possesses pride that manifests itself in deception. The next instance we will discuss is Odysseus and the Cyclops. The encounter with the Cyclops might be the most recognizable scene from the Odyssey. Here I will talk only of the beginning of the scene. Odysseus and his men find themselves trapped in the Cyclops cave because Odysseus and his men decided to not only eat the food they found, but Odysseus felt entitled to gifts that he just presumed the person living in the cave should automatically give to anyone, even if they just happen to invite themselves in and start eating their food supply. Rules of hospitality in ancient Greece are beside the point for the significance of this scene. Minus the presumption of a prestigious marriage aimed at making himself the chief man in a society, Odysseus and his men do not seem to engage in behavior too different from the suitors. The ending of the Cyclops scene, moreover, only serves to reinforce Odysseus's pride and lack of concern for his men. When glorifying in his own deceptive abilities, Odysseus fully identifies himself to the Cyclops, who did not know who Odysseus was. The mistake will cost Odysseus not only precious time, but will set him and his men up against Poseidon. I will not spend too much time on Poseidon right here, since I have already spoken on Homer's gods in my analysis of the Iliad. But suffice to say, the gods of Homer are arbitrary tyrants that are prisoners of their emotions, have no regard for mortal life, are patrons of subjective truth, and act more like demons than divinities. It should, moreover, be noted that Odysseus's men will lose their lives through their own folly. But all the same, the pride and presumption of Odysseus not only hinders his men and his men's journey home, but costs the lives of some of Odysseus's men who are eaten by the Cyclops. By the end of the Cyclops scene, with Odysseus' escape and his prideful boast, we return to the question of how much Odysseus is ruled by pride. Is Odysseus so lost in his own prideful view of his own deceptive abilities and cunning that he believes he can outsmart any creature, human and god? The enchantress Circe certainly seems to think so, who, along with Calypso, does not exactly have to twist the arm of Odysseus to get him to sleep with them over the course of his 10-year journey home. This is yet another factor we must take under consideration. But this situation with Circe and Calypso is not so straightforward. Notably, Odysseus rejects immortality so he can be with his wife. Further, while it is tempting to relativize this behavior to the double standard of Greek societal gender norms, adultery being considered a crime by the ancient Hebrews per God of the Ten Commandments demonstrates the universal understanding, universal in the sense of not being limited to space and time, of adultery as a crime and sin. In short, the affair with Calypso and Circe and the lack of force they used on Odysseus to participate in these love affairs does not help Odysseus' case. However, to go back to my original point about Odysseus, Circe mentions to Odysseus that readers can take to be the best explanation of who Odysseus is as a man and, by extension, the philosophical argument Odysseus represents. When Circe is warning Odysseus about the dangers of Charybdis and Scylla, Odysseus wonders of a way to survive both dangers, to which Circe replies, quote, "So stubborn, can't you bow to the deathless gods themselves?" Throughout the Odyssey, Odysseus is consistently relying on his cunning, even in situations where it is not called for. In the few scenes analyzed, we can thus draw the conclusion that Odysseus represents human cunning in a world that is riddled with conflict between forces of nature. Odysseus also represents the accompanying pride that goes in hand with the almost total reliance on one's own cunning. However, this is only half of our analysis of Odysseus, and if we understand Odysseus' character and his clashes with the world he lives in, that he or Homer believes to be, we must also consider Odysseus as a man when it comes to his clashes with both society and with the gods, which I will cover in the next episode as I have fully reached the end of the content of the treatment of Odysseus as a man in and of himself, which sets us up for his clashes with the gods, Poseidon namely, and society back home in Ithaca. Thank you for listening to this episode of